Hey there.
Max,
Good morning, good
thanks for inviting me.
afternoon. Hey, yeah, thanks. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are. Welcome back to another Red Pill Religion podcast, Red Pill Religion, where amongst the things we say is that a good religious argument is a great thing between friends. It's also just good to have a religious conversation. We're going to be doing some of that tonight. If you like the kind of stuff you see us doing, please find us on redpillreligion.com, where we update every day. In these days of social media censorship, remember you can find us on BitChute, and you can now find us on Elbree as well as on YouTube. Give us a like and a subscribe if while we're still on YouTube, even though we're on like our third or fourth channel now. But we ain't going away. Find us on other social media platforms. Find us on Gab in the Center too, because we're very much believers in platforms like that and Elbree and other independents to come in and challenge the establishment. Please also do hit the donate button if you get a chance. And we're trying to upgrade equipment and our podcasting networks. In any case, I'm pleased to say that joining us again tonight is Charlie Moscowitz. Say hi to everybody, Charlie.
Thanks for having me, as always.
Great fun. I keep forgetting. Is it Chuck? Charles? Charles?
Charles.
Charles Best? Okay. Charles Best. I apologize. That's fine. Everybody, please go check out Charles's YouTube channel, Charles Moscowitz, Moscowitz. I see his featured video there is a debate he had with E. Michael Jones. I don't suppose the subjects of Jews and Judaism came up at all in the conversation.
Oh no, definitely not. I mean, yeah. I mean, I don't know if you've seen his book. It's as big as a dictionary.
Yeah,
the Jewish Revolutionary Spirit.
I have not read it, and okay. I have merely listened to endless hours of him talking about it because, and I think he makes a lot of good points. And for the record of the audience, as I've said before, some people get mad at me, but no matter where you are on these things, someone gets mad at you. So I'm going to make it really clear. To the audience and anybody listening, I'm 53 this year. And I've never in my life hated Jews. I've never even understand why somebody would hate a Jew. I always even felt somewhat protective of them because of the Holocaust and stuff. But I've had many great Jewish friends of various political and religious views. So the last time we had a show, Charlie, we talked about the Jewish issue.
Yes.
And what I'm interested in talking about today, believe it or not, is the Catholic issue.
Yes.
And one of the first things in our last podcast, I said I wanted to talk about the history of Catholic-Jewish relations. And I got to tell you, one complaint I have as a Catholic is that it seems to me like some Jews are really hot to talk about this, that, or the other things the Catholics did to the Jews. But it's like, all right, well, you got 2,000 years of history between large numbers of people. Horrible crap's going to happen. But I would contend that anybody who really looks at history should see that for the most part, while there have been times when Jews were bad to Catholics or when Catholics have been bad to Jews, for the most part, it's been a history of peaceful coexistence. Would you dispute that?
Oh, not at all. I totally agree. I think there's much too emphasis put by Jews and probably by Catholics on the negative aspects. It's a complicated relationship. The Jews were in Europe right in the beginning, even before Catholicism.
Oh, yeah.
And they have together been the backbone of European civilization, European morality. I think the Jews contributed a lot more to Catholicism, actually, than Catholics or Jews know. I think they provided a moral and ethical backbone in many ways to the Catholic Church because they are the people of the book, because the Jew is studying Torah and doing so on a daily basis, and that the Jew obviously is a minority in the countries that are Catholic. The Catholics have the army, they've got the king, they have the majority. So there are problems associated with that, and at the same time, a lot of the laws that the Catholic kingdoms passed about Jews, keeping them separate, not allowing them to go into certain professions, it actually solidified the Jewish community in many ways. And, it sort of created a symbiotic relationship between the Jews and the Catholic aristocracy that could at times become very unhealthy, but was a functioning aspect of these kingdoms and how they functioned together. And I think that the Jews, because we were in a diaspora for 2,000 years, we became a little bit more tribal than we may have otherwise become, because we felt a kinship with Jews from all of the different countries of Europe. When a Jew traveled to Vienna or Budapest or Prague or Paris, they could be in touch with other Jews who were there and expect, in a sense, to be taken care of somewhat. I mean, there was a familiarity. It was almost a familial relationship. And emanating from that was that Jews often got into diplomacy and trade in these countries because they could transport goods and services across borders, because they had people in these other cities that they could talk to, and that they could conduct diplomacy between kingdoms because they could go to these other cities, and each of the kings and each of the princes and each of the dukes, they tended to have their own preferred Jewish advisors. And so it sort of evolved into a role of kind of a go-between, a sort of a middleman, if you will, that it could help resolve conflict, but there's also downsides to that as well. And I guess that the overall fact is that I do think that Jews made up a major portion of Catholicism for the 1,000 years that the Catholics ruled Europe. And it's one that's underrated. I think that they played a big role, not just in terms of the trade and diplomacy, but I think also in terms of ethics and morals, because the Jews have a very high standard. Now, I'm not talking about individual Jews here. Believe me, it's some pretty bad ones. I mean, we're not how far from perfect. I'm talking about the whole overall body of work. The Torah, the Talmud, all of these things which guide the Jew in his daily life. They guide our interactions with each other and with non-Jews. They guide our conduct of business, of family, of labor, of all aspects of our lives. And I think that lent a certain moral foundation even for Catholicism.
That's an interesting way of putting it. I would at least give you this, and it would be the same thing that Michael Jones would say, which is that basically we do think the Catholic religion is the continuation of Judaism. In fact, one of the cool things, if you really look into it, is that the design of Catholic churches, especially the altar, the sacristy, a whole lot of it, is actually very much based on the descriptions of the temple design. So you got there's variations because, of course, the descriptions of the design of the Jewish temple can be interpreted different ways, right? But they're almost always designed on that. And even in the most Orthodox are supposed to be built facing Jerusalem. They don't always do that these days. But it's funny. And a lot of the rites and rituals that they say are that some Protestants, not all, but some, the rites, the incense, all that stuff, those come right out of Jewish practice and before the temple was destroyed. All that smells and bells, the priests and all that, the Jewish religions lost that when it lost the temple. But the Catholics think, the Orthodox too, all the Orthodox type Christians think that this is what they're doing, that they're continuing temple worship. We don't need a temple anymore because the body of Christ is the temple. But we still have an altar and we still make sacrifice to it. The sacrifice is the Eucharist. But I mean, it's all based on temple practice. And I'm quite certain that, there was Jewish influence on all of it, because I can go back to even some of the earliest church fathers I know at least one or two in the 3rd century, 4th century even, would often go to study and learn Hebrew from the rabbis,
Right.
And so this relationship has been complicated because one of the things, that we'll get a rap for is that, okay, the Catholic Europe said, well, the Jews, they have to be kept separate. Except, you portray that as the worst thing in the world. And yet at the same time, look, these are different religious worldviews,
I think it's something that both Jews and Catholics actually agree on, maybe for different reasons. The Catholics, I mean, and E. Michael Jones gets into this in his book, that they followed the diktat of Sicut Judaeus non, which is a Latin term for meaning, it was developed by St. Augustine, that the Jew was to be left alone in their worship. They were to be respected in the fact that they are the people of the book and they're not to be bothered. But at the same time, the Jew is to be kept separate and not allowed to have any high hand in the political and cultural affairs of the world, because of the fact that we were involved with crucifying Christ. Now, I totally understand the idea, and it's kind of a standard Christian belief, I think both Catholics and Protestants, that the temple and the worship at the temple and the covenant, if you will, of the Mosaic covenant was replaced by Jesus, who came and fulfilled it. I get that. I think it says that in the New Testament. I think there could be different interpretations of that, but I understand that that's the conventional Christian understanding. It replaced Judaism.
One, yeah. The simple conventional understanding. Right.
And I respect it. Of course, that's what Christians believe. Why wouldn't they believe that? I mean, the new Israel, it fulfilled the Torah. We're not going to agree on that. That's something that we'll never know. I mean, it's just we, as Jews, we believe that we are continuing the covenant of Moses. I would point to a couple of passages in the New Testament where Jesus himself said this, that the covenant between Moses and the Jewish people is forever. But the fact is that also we also continue the temple worship in a more abstract sense, and in that we have on Friday night, on Shabbos, we have Kiddush with the wine and with the bread, the challah, and there's ritual around that, and there's certain prayers that are said, and there's a ceremony that every Jewish family does. I mean, at least every observant Jewish family does. And I think that it's very similar, frankly, to the Mass. I mean, we don't believe in the blood and body of Christ, but it's still a reenactment of temple worship, and that the Talmud basically put together a means by which we could continue to worship as we wait for the rebuilding of the temple. And there have been periods, and this is something, again, which I think Jews and Christians, Orthodox Jews and Orthodox Christians disagree, in that, and Michael Jones says this in his book, that we can't possibly be valid anymore because the temple was destroyed. Judaism has functioned without the temple. I mean, it functioned without the first temple for a long time, and it functioned between temples, right? I mean, it's not so much an issue of, it's an important element in Judaism. It has a lot to do with a messianic understanding, but Judaism has always had what we now call Talmudic Judaism, in that we always had these centers of learning, which could be very small. It could be just 10 men getting together in someone's living room. But this was where Torah was studied, where prayers were conducted, where ceremonies were enacted, and where the community would study and understand and try to perceive what it is that God was telling us in the Torah. And this is something that has happened every single day from the moment of creation right until today. And it's regardless of whether or not you do sacrifices at the temple.
This, by the way, is why you can't outlaw religion, or if you try, you get nothing but disaster, kill a bunch of people, and still the religion doesn't survive. If we embarked on a mass campaign to destroy the Jewish religion worldwide and spent $1 trillion to do it, we would fail.
Well, that's right, because there's not a day, as I say, there has not been a day that, and I'm very proud of that. I think that there's a divine aspect to that. To me, that proves the validity of the covenant, that regardless of any situation that might be going on, the Jewish people have observed the Sabbath. They have observed the daily prayers. Not every Jew, of course. I don't even do it every day, but the point is that it's being done by enough people that. Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead. No, we agree. And this is actually going to be true of other religions too. It does not work to try and stamp out. You're not going to stamp out Islam, for example. Right. You may convert people out of Islam or something like that, or maybe, but you'll never stamp it out. In fact, if you try, you will make it a stronger religion. This is why some of the anti-jihadists need to cool their jets, because they're making it worse, not better. They're making it impossible to have a rational conversation.
Well, I mean, you have to stand up to jihad, because jihad is war. I mean, it's
you do.
It's a physical attempt. They're trying to stamp you out, and if someone's trying to stamp you out, you have to counter them on the field of battle. I mean, you have to. It's a survival thing.
No, I agree. I'm just saying, though, still, at the end of the day, unless you think you're both going to wipe each other out, which isn't going to happen, you have to be able to at least talk to them.
Well, I agree with that.
And when it comes to let's look at it realistically. A lot of moderns are stupid about religion, and they think that you can shrug it off like it'll go away, but it'll never go away ever. Religion in general. In fact, if you look around the world right now, I'll give you stats on this if you need it. I'll give you references. Religion generally, all religions are growing, and with the possible exception of Buddhism, and only the possible exception of Buddhism, all major world religions are growing faster than the population is growing. Hinduism is growing faster than the Indian population, for example. In fact, they're having a huge revival. Shintoism and the Shinto-Buddhist hybrid Japanese way is exploding, and their governments are embracing it. So my point is, religion never goes away and can't be treated as an irrelevancy. The spiritual is real and matters to people. And so now, if I am a believing Catholic, let's talk about this Jewish separatism thing, and as if it's the most evil thing in the world. I pretty much believe the things that I believe to be true. And, there are certain central things like that we believe that Jews do not. Now, or Muslims or Hindus or anybody else. Now, you've got these people living among you of a different religion. Well, what can happen is they start teaching your children things that are alien to your religious beliefs. And you might go, oh, well, that's a good thing, that's liberal, that's whatever. At some point, that really creates severe conflict. I mean, we could do this either way, but let's go back 500 years and let's just have me, a Christian, walk into the middle of a Jewish village and start telling the children that that their parents are going to hell if they don't embrace Jesus. Mm-hmm. How well do you think that will go over in terms of community relations?
It would go nowhere. I mean, it's I understand that that's the Christian belief.
Well, right, but okay, let's flip it up, because I'm looking at this from a sociological perspective. Mm-hmm. Flip it the other way. Jew comes in and starts telling the kids Jesus is fake. Again, what any sensible person knows, you are asking for conflict. You are asking for and while Jewish and Christian values are very similar, they're not the same. They're gonna butt heads. If you want a tranquil society, it actually makes sense to have a certain separatism. And in fact, Jewish custom is to be separate anyway.
It is. So, and I also I just want to interject and say that generally speaking, Jews don't do that. I mean, we don't go in.
Generally speaking, Christians don't either.
Yeah, we don't get in, and we don't get into questions of Jesus. I'm not saying it's never happened. I mean, in the Middle Ages, you had those great disputations, like the Disputation of Tortosa, where you had priests and rabbis sit around in a big circle and debate issues of Jesus. It was a mistake for Jews to do it, and they knew it. I mean, and it didn't work out well. But with those sorts of exceptions aside, generally speaking, Jews have not done that. They shouldn't do it. It's not our business. That's not our place to get into questions of Christology. That's a Christian question. And if anything, we hope that Christians strengthen their faith. I mean, it's not a matter of trying to undermine the Christian faith at all.
Right. And so, but now I'm looking at it from the perspective of a king or a kingdom, because they'll portray these ancient policies or these ancient agreements like, oh, it was the wicked, dastardly Catholic Church was hurting the Jews and treating them separate. It's like, A, they wanted to be separate, And B, just from a practical governing perspective of, let's say, a country with 1 million people and 50,000 Jews, and everybody else is Catholic or not very religious, but it's basically a Catholic country. It works if people don't get into religious arguments and their kids don't fight with each other, and the people with the different beliefs live separately from each other. And that's actually a good way to make friends.
I totally agree. And I don't understand why Jews have sometimes made a big issue of the fact that Christian and Catholic countries set up ghettos. The word ghetto comes from it's an Italian word. The first one was set up in Venice. And, why is that? I mean, it's not a perfect system, and there probably were bad stuff that happened, with that. But generally speaking, it was a reasonable thing to do. And Jews generally want to live amongst themselves. Even in this country, you find neighborhoods where Jews tend to move in with other Jews, and they have a synagogue, and, they're like, gee, is it a Jewish neighborhood? It's sort of a natural thing. And it's a natural thing for ethnic people to do this as well.
Yeah,
it's nothing wrong with it. I mean, it's an informal ghetto. In fact, they even sometimes jokingly will refer to the Jewish ghetto of a certain community. It's not. I mean, this isn't some kind of a shameful thing at all.
Right.
And also the Catholic Church. This is another aspect of Catholic Europe, and I think Protestants too, that they allowed Jews to develop their own administration, their own government. They called it the Kahal, and that Jews had their own court system. In fact, oftentimes a Catholic who was accused of a capital crime would seek out a Jewish court because the Jewish courts were a little bit more liberal. They weren't executing as. It's very rare that somebody would be recommended for execution by Jewish judges. But the point I'm making here is that the Jews developed their own governing infrastructure, their own religious infrastructure. And the real history of the Catholic Church is that, with some glaring exceptions, for the most part, this was an accepted system. Certainly was in Poland, which is a very Catholic country. And
it was like the golden age for the Jews for a while in Poland.
Yeah. For many, many centuries. Now, something that E. Michael Jones points out in his book that I thought was very interesting is that the Catholic Church in around the Renaissance time, they set up certain orders, particularly the Franciscan order, but I think also the Dominican order, where these priests their mission was to convert the Jews. And in the process of preparing themselves to do this, they studied Judaism, they studied the Torah, they learned Hebrew, they studied Talmud. They actually delved into Jewish texts, and I think they studied with rabbis, and they really learned Judaism, and they were successful. They did convert a lot of Jews to Catholicism, especially in France and in Italy and in western part of Germany. But at the same time, and this isn't anything that Michael Jones said, I was thinking about this because I did read his book. I think that study of Judaism changed the Franciscans. It actually made them in many ways more Jewish because of the impact that had. And through that pipeline, the Catholic Church became a bit more Jewish from the experience. So both sides benefited from it in a way. I mean,
I will ask you to send me a reference to that because I'm currently seriously considering becoming what's called a lay Franciscan, which is for everyday ordinary people who live regular lives but want to be involved it's called a secular or lay order, but I might be becoming a Franciscan. And in fact, Maximilian Kolbe, Saint Max, was a Franciscan.
Mm-hmm. It's a great tradition, and I think they're very scholarly and they're very devout and pious. It's a great tradition. I think that would be great.
It hurts my feelings because it's like people want to have this the Catholic Church just becomes the villain in everybody's narrative. And I think the thing that really bugs me the most, Charles, is this one. I recommend this book highly to you. If you haven't had a chance to read it, I definitely recommend it to your audience and to our audience. There is this widespread myth that during World War II, the Pope and the Vatican were Nazi central.
complete garbage. And I totally agree with you. That is a horrendous smear on Pope Pius XII, who probably saved more Jewish lives than any other single person in Europe. I mean, it's a
God bless
ridiculous,
you for
and
saying.
it had to do with this play that was written in the late 1950s called The Deputy. That was a complete work of fiction. It became somewhat of an accepted idea among Jews. It is completely wrong. I completely agree with you. It is utter. I mean, here you have a man who was functioning as the head of the Catholic Church during the Nazi occupation of Europe. That takes a lot of courage. It's easy for people to sit in the United States and talk about this.
Oh, yeah.
When the Nazis occupied, I don't know if people realize this, but when the Nazis occupied Italy after Mussolini collapsed in 1944, they went in and they had an order to go into the Vatican and arrest the Pope. Probably he would have been executed. And the Vatican locked the doors, and suddenly the Swiss Guard became an army, and they guarded the Vatican, and it was like under siege. And people need to realize that the Catholic Church harbored hundreds of thousands, if not up to 1 million young people, children mostly, but young people in homes, in convents. You have people.
The Vatican itself.
The Vatican itself. There was the Cardinal of Paris, I think Lutziger, who was a Jewish child who was taken in by a Catholic family or a group of priests. Madeleine Albright, the Secretary of State, was a Jewish child who was taken in by Catholics and was brought up Catholic. Now there's controversy around that, and there are certain cases where some people just they weren't told about their roots and all that stuff. But those things are just the important fact is that they saved these lives, and we're talking about more lives than anyone else, certainly more than the United States saved in terms of Jews.
Albert Einstein himself said when he found out how much the Vatican had actually done to help the Jews, he could no longer. He had nothing but respect and love for the Catholic Church, and that's something Albert Einstein said. He never lost his more or less atheism, agnostic. Well, he wasn't. He was more of an agnostic pantheist guy, but still.
Right.
And in fact, he greatly befriended a guy named Georges Lemaitre. Do you know who that is?
I've heard of him.
Georges Lemaitre was a Jesuit priest who formulated the Big Bang Theory.
Oh.
And the Big Bang Theory, maybe you don't believe in it. Most people do these days. We're not here to debate it. But it was a Catholic priest named Georges Lemaitre, and he's a cosmologist, and he formulated it. And he formulated it based on Albert Einstein's theory of relativity. And when he formulated it, Einstein at first did not like it. His immediate response was, "Your math is good, but your physics is terrible." But then he attended a presentation on the Big Bang by Lemaitre, and at the end of it, he stood up and said, "You are the first. This is the first person who has fully understood relativity and converted to believing in the Big Bang." Wow. And it was a lifelong friendship. And
well, I mean, I feel the same way. By the way, I mean, I feel grateful that the Catholic Church did stick its neck out during World War II and did rescue as many Jews as they did. And to me, it's one of those unwritten chapters of the whole war. So, this to me was a terrible smear. It was done by people, Jew and non-Jew alike, but probably, unfortunately, a good number of Jews who were trying to undermine the Catholic Church and its moral authority. And it's wrong, totally wrong.
Oh, God bless you for recognizing it. I do recommend this book, The Myth of Hitler's Pope, Pope Pius XII and His Secret War Against Nazi Germany by David G. Dalen. By the way, that is Rabbi David G. Dalen, the big old Jew.
Yeah, right. No, I get it. So
I'm not for the audience's point I mentioned.
Well, I hope that we can sort of get some forgiveness for this kind of nonsense and this sin of smearing.
there's a large anti-Catholic element, and there are definitely Jews within it.
Sure.
I genuinely blame the secular element in general that just hates religion and hates any idea of God. And that's what you get out of globalist Marxism and what I would call secular ethnic nationalism. Where you put, I'm not against nationalism. Nationalism is not a bad word. It's natural for there to be nations. But when all of a sudden you are all about preserving white Americans or black Americans or Arabs, we need the pure, true Arab race. Arab nationalists are very dangerous, by the way, just like every other kind is.
Right.
That's your ethnic nationalists. That is not people who believe, even if they don't all have the same idea of God. I'll tell you, even when dealing with the Muslims, they have a sense of honor that can be, and a set of values that can at least be spoken to, and yeah, I'm starting to wander a little bit, but the point is that, there's multiple groups. It's not just the Jews. That is probably the one thing that makes me wince a little too much. Sometimes when Michael Jones is like, is there anybody responsible for any of this who's not Jewish? So I'm just curious,
Well, I could comment on that, but I would maybe draw a distinction between ethnic nationalism and ethnic supremacy.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with, first of all, as you say, nationalism. That's a great force. The development of the nation state, I think, is a very progressive thing. It's not necessarily even an old thing. It's something that really began to develop over many, many centuries, if not millennia. And the ethnic makeup of a state is not necessarily a bad thing either, as long as it doesn't infringe on the rights of minorities, and particularly the most vulnerable of all minorities, and that is the individual thinker. But what I differentiate with is this idea that a particular ethnicity is superior. That's supremacy. That's a problem. And then also the United States is not an ethnic state. It's a national state, but we never were. I mean, the founding fathers of this country, they were English, but they weren't thinking of themselves in that way. We're going to create an English empire. They were Germans, they were Irish, there were people from all various backgrounds coming into the colonies, French, and generally speaking, people assimilated, and they didn't think of themselves in that way. They thought of themselves as American. In fact, George Washington mentions this in his famous farewell address. He goes, "Look, I understand that people have," and I'm paraphrasing here, various people in various regions and various groups have their own manners, as he put it, and their own customs. But my hope as president, saying goodbye to my office, is that the American people will put their nation first over these other considerations, while at the same time respecting those other considerations if they choose to.
No, it makes sense. The great American experiment. I do often find myself wondering if it will fail, just because of things that have happened. I get tired of it. As a Catholic, for example, I've even heard from some American so-called nationalists that Catholics aren't real Americans. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. I've really heard that one, and nobody flinches. And I'm like, wait a minute. And their reasoning will often be, well, it may just be that their own religion is primitive and they've been taught to hate Catholicism their whole lives. There's millions of those. Sure. But for a whole bunch of others, they have this idea of, I don't really ascribe to the melting pot idea, at least not the ethnic melting pot.
No, neither do I. In fact,
I just wanted to make the point that these folks will have this idea that there was a pure strain of Yankee Americans, basically white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And they are taking a very narrow slice of American history in order to make that. First, by not acknowledging that a lot of the Protestants early on that were here were not considered white, including a lot of Irish. And second, that in reality, while there was only one founding father who was Catholic, in point of fact, the state of Maine was established as a Catholic colony and has been, had been Catholic for most of its history, predominantly Catholic.
I didn't know that.
And I mean, it was. And actually, during Thomas Jefferson's tenure as president,
I think you mean Maryland. if I'm not mistaken.
Maryland.
Yeah.
I think you're correct. I
Okay.
think you're correct. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Maine, Maryland, they're
I was
practically
just thinking, Maine doesn't strike me as being particularly Catholic, but
Maryland.
yeah.
I think you're right. Yeah. And the fact is that as the United States moved westward, it picked up a ton of Catholics. As soon as they made the Louisiana Purchase, instantly quite a few Catholics became American citizens. As soon as Texas became part of the territory, tons of Catholics became Americans. And as soon as California became a state, or even a territory, a ton of Catholics, including native Spanish speakers, became Americans who had been there. In fact, Catholic Spanish speakers and Catholic French speakers have been in the United States since before it was the United States.
That's right, of course.
For centuries before it was the United States.
And by the way, I also don't subscribe to the so-called melting pot. I mean, Michael Jones has had a big impact on my thinking. His book, The Slaughter of Cities, he gets into this and he talks about how of course, he blames the Jews, but let's put that aside for a minute.
Mm-hmm.
The social engineers, let's put it that way, the change agents, starting in the 1930s and onward, they started to pressure ethnic city groups like the Irish, the Italians, quite frankly, the Jews, to move out to the burbs. They welcomed in African Americans and other groups, and that when they went out to the burbs, they became white, and they lost their ethnic identity. And I think there's truth to that, and I think that's sad.
There's nothing, sad.
It's this a lot to be said. I'm not sure that people of those ethnic enclaves wouldn't have moved out to the suburbs anyways. That's just the way it goes. I mean, neighborhoods change. People do, move for a lot of reasons, but it's no question that these change agents, these engineers, gave them a little push.
In fairness to Michael Jones, he does not put it all on the Jews. He says it's a Jewish and the WASP belief. And and in testament to that, I lived in it. He says the Jews did it, or the Jews and the WASP. And it's like, wait a minute, which ones? That's where because it is true that prominent Jewish organizations and prominent white WASP Protestant groups did plan a lot of this. They did want it to happen. It's not like it was just a Jewish cabal, though. And I did watch it happen. I literally grew up. Not the whole time, but I spent some of my most formative years in Marquette Park in the same Lithuanian Catholic neighborhood that E. Michael Jones talks about a lot. And, they did bring in these people who didn't belong there and put these projects there just to create the ethnic tension. And then they gave them, tax and loan incentives that made going out to the suburbs cheaper and easier. And then, I think without that incentive, a lot of people would have moved into the suburbs anyway. But I think Marquette Park would be a Lithuanian Catholic neighborhood still.
Well, I mean, I witnessed the end of the same phenomena with regard to the Jewish neighborhood in Boston. I'm in Boston. I'm a Bostonian here. And the Jewish neighborhood in Boston, which was primarily in Roxbury, parts of Dorchester and Mattapan, it was moved out. I mean, with redlining and with loans and with moving people in and all of that stuff. There's a good book about this by a sociologist who I think is now retired. He's a professor at Boston University. I think his name is Abba Hillel Singer, if I'm not mistaken, where he documents this very well. My grandparents went through it. My parents remembered it. And you go to these neighborhoods today and you see a lot of synagogues that are boarded up or they've been converted to black churches. Now, I'm not in any way denigrating that. I mean, they're great neighborhoods. They're great black neighborhoods. There was, I mean, especially now because Boston has really come a ways. I mean, it's not the Boston of the 70s where there was riots and fires and real poverty. Now Boston is moving up. But the point is that, the neighborhood did change and there was a deliberate movement to make that happen. So it was the Jews themselves were the ones who were pushed out. And I think that there probably is the case in other urban neighborhoods where the Jews were pushed out. I think that happened in Brooklyn also.
I think that that is probably the number one flaw in Jones, and he gets hyper focused I think he doesn't look enough at non-Jewish elements in all kinds of weird, horrible occult religions. And he doesn't, the program obviously targeting Catholic neighborhoods was probably the biggest target because they were the biggest target. But I'm quite certain they wanted ethnic neighborhoods broken up in general. They didn't
Yes.
ethnic neighborhoods. You know, a Greek Orthodox neighborhood might as well be Catholic. A fairly Orthodox conservative Jewish neighborhood might as well be Catholic. You know, they wanted those cities completely turned over. And they
That's
wanted
right.
to embrace racial identity, which I hate more and more every day. I'm so-called white, and I will have people, you know, even call me a traitor to the white race or sometimes because of some of my views. But I'm like, dude, I don't relate to people on whiteness. I mean, it's a factor. You know, if I'm in a crowd of Mexicans and I notice one other white guy, maybe, you know, but I have.
Well, I mean, to show you how silly it's become. I mean, as a Jew, I'm thought of as white. I mean, certainly my brothers think of themselves as white. They would be
What
shocked
does
to
that
think
even mean?
otherwise.
And what does that even mean,
Of
man? I
course,
mean,
it's a social construct. I'm going to comment briefly, if you don't mind, about Dr. Jones's commentary on the Jews and the wasps.
uh-huh.
And I think that this relates to maybe a traditional Catholic view, which he embraces. He argues that because the Jews were responsible for the crucifixion of Christ. Now, I don't want to go too much into that. I don't know if I even agree with that, but let's just say, for the sake of argument, that they were responsible for it. But because of that, they no longer they're in a state of rebellion. They're in a state of subversion. They lost the logos, the idea of order and faith, which I would argue is completely not true, and I could prove that. But putting that aside, I'm talking about his theory, which I think is somewhat consonant with Christian understanding. That because we are in rebellion, because we have a revolutionary spirit, as he points out, we are responsible for every revolutionary movement that's ever happened in the Western world. And he includes in that any movement that opposed the Catholic Church, and that means Martin Luther. I mean, he does a chapter on this, that Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation was a Judaizing influence because they were rebellious, because they were revolutionary against the church, and thus, putting aside the fact that Martin Luther was more anti-Semitic than Catholicism ever would dream of being. Let's put that aside. The fact is that he viewed the British breakaway from Catholicism under Henry VIII and Elizabeth as a Judaizing rebellion, because there's some wizard by the name of John Dee who was influenced by the Kabbalah, and he gets into this whole, rather convoluted thing that because of that, the Jews are responsible. So he views the whole WASP movement, the whole British movement, as a Judaizing movement, because everything kind of goes into this theological sieve, that anything that is opposed to Catholicism becomes Judaizing. And so I think that in that understanding, you could say that the WASP Jewish alliance is normal because the WASPs are Judaized. He's referred to the United States as the most Jewish nation in history because the American Revolution was a Jewish revolution. So I have read his book, and he does at least imply, if not state, he puts it through this sieve. And with due respect, I mean, he's a brilliant thinker, and I admire the research, and it's great, and it's a great read, by the way. But the thesis is I would suggest, questionable.
I think the thesis is questionable on a few scores, and I'd like to break them down a few ways. I think there's both a great deal of truth in it and missed truths that can paint a distorted figure. The number one thing, because I've had some guys, including some fellow more Orthodox, I have friends who are either Catholic or Orthodox Christians generally. I get along with some Protestants, but some Protestants I just don't, and it's too bad. I can't help it. I do my best, God help maybe get better. But they're like, I'm like, you want me to believe it's all the Jews? And they're like, yeah, they've been involved in every blah, 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 blah. I'm like,
right.
Okay, so wait a minute. Now, Did the Jews invent Babylonian mystery religion? Did the Jews invent the Hindu religion? Did the Hindus invent the witchcraft and weird stuff that people like what's her name? Abramovich?
Blavatsky.
Oh no, Blavatsky. Well, wasn't she Jewish?
That's a theosophy. Exactly. It came from Russian Orthodoxy. And by the way, the Illuminati, came from the Jesuits. I mean, it was a Catholic movement. And Dr. Jones kind of glosses over that. He mentions it, but he glosses over it because he claims that Abbe Baruel, who wrote one of the definitive books about the Illuminati and how they influenced the French Revolution, he claims that he was a British spy, or that he was in the employ of the British, and the British were Judaizers. So therefore, in a very roundabout way, it's the Jews.
I can actually see a negative influence from the rabbis on Protestantism. But I can, and it would get to specific things. Like I don't think the Masoretic texts are trustworthy, and I don't think Christians should use them at all, because they were produced in a time after Christ, and there's reason to suspect the Jews would have and that's not an offensive thing to say to a Jewish person, even, actually.
No, not at all. It's a different
agreement. Yeah,
it's a different thing. But we all have our different texts. I don't have a problem.
Exactly. And the 66 book canon, same way. But at the same time, it's like at some point you're responsible for your own religion now. You've taken whatever quote unquote Judaizing that you've undergone, supposedly. Now you're still responsible for what you do. It's not like the touch of the Jewish idea suddenly turns you demonic or something. It does get a little heavy sometimes. So he makes some great connections. He says some things that need to be said, and that's why I do respect him. But
absolutely.
I think his fans do need to realize, especially this, and this is an old thing that's true. For almost any proposition, you can find evidence for it.
Well, if you set up an ideological, box, you can bring anything into it and mold it from that. And that's a danger. It's not that we shouldn't have ideologies, but you have to step a little bit back sometimes. I mean, by the way, if he thinks that the American Revolution is a Judaizing movement, I say hallelujah. I'll take that one. I mean, it gave birth to the greatest country in history.
I have a more
right,
negative view of America and its empire than you do at this point, Charlie.
I'm
cynical, but I understand exactly what the sentiment is. There are good things to say about America, especially.
Maybe we should get credit for baseball too. I don't know.
Yeah, the Jews gave us baseball. Boring game. I hate
the boy chicks of summer is a book. There's a book published by the Jewish ball players.
But at the same time, I think it's fair to say, and I think this is really true more of atheistic Jews and Jews who don't take religion seriously at all. That there is there becomes this Jewish supremacy, there becomes this Jewish cliquishness, and this Jewish preferenceness that has lost any godly roots and is just real tribalism, and we're superior. But that can happen to any group.
You're right to point that out. I mean, when you remove the belief and when you remove the moral and ethical code of Sinai, all you have left is supremacy, and that's a very negative thing. These Jews that you're talking about, they formed alliance with non-Jews who also are globalist and who are, messianic in nature. It is a complete heresy, and it's. I've gotten into this in several of my books. How the Sabbatean conspiracy and the Frankist conspiracy corrupted a large part of the Jewish body, and still does. It's a poison.
I want to hear about that because I was just listening on to a podcast called Our Interesting Times. Have you heard of it? Our Interesting Times?
Yeah.
Very good.
Oh, you're talking about Timothy Kelly.
Yeah.
Oh, he's great. Very good guy.
In fact, he puts me to shame. I want to be doing what he's doing.
Yeah, me too. He's a tremendous mind.
I'm sure he's younger than me, and I'm so impressed with. And he's better than I am. He knows how to handle it. Anyway, yeah, he was just talking about that very movement on a podcast. I think it was up this week, so you might want to go look for it.
I will. Thank
you. Yeah. What is the basics of these Sabbateans?
Well, I mean, in a nutshell, in the 16th century there was actually the 16th century, 17th century, 1666. There was this false messiah by the name of Shabtai Zvi, and he's a Turkish. He was from Smyrna. he was influenced by Lurianic Kabbalah, which came out of the city of Svat, which was in the Holy Land. But I would suggest that he twisted and misinterpreted the rabbis of Svat, who were holy men, and he became convinced that he was the Messiah. Now, there is a tradition in the Talmud that says that the Messiah will come when mankind had reached such a spiritual level where we are so much knowing God and his will and his morals that we'll be ready for it, that the world will be prepared for it. Either that, or we'll reach a point where we've descended into such sin that the Messiah will come to save us. Well, Shabtai Zvi went with the sin side of it. He desecrated the Torah. He got up on the bima, in front of the Torah at his synagogue, and he tried to utter the name of God, and he did some things that are complete anathema, complete blasphemy. He then engaged in every kind of thing you can imagine, all kinds of sexual immoralities, and every kind of non-kosher, and just he broke every single command of the Torah, as did his movement, because he said that if we can sin such a degree, then that's the Messiah, that's the Messianic age. And he traveled around mostly Ottoman Empire like a rock star. It was like Mick Jagger and the Stones. I mean, people were flocking. I mean, he had, he was given a lot of attention. There have always been rumors that the Vatican might have been behind this. I don't know if that's true or not. We'll never know. But it was a very corrupting influence on Judaism. It caused, he had emissaries go out throughout Europe who were crazy people, who were hippies in a way, and they would go into communities and they would do these magic tricks, and a lot of Jews went for this. I mean, he got a big following throughout Europe. Even a lot of non-Jews went for it too.
Sure. And then it didn't work out, but they're still around?
No. Well, what happened is, in 1666, which is an interesting number because that's Christian, the Book of Revelations, and that's why people think there might have been a Catholic hand in this. He goes to the Sultan in Constantinople, and everybody thought this is it. He's going to take over the empire, and this was the moment we've all been waiting for. People were selling their property and getting ready to go to the Holy Land, and people were going berserk over this. It was a big movement, and the Sultan said to him, "I'm going to shoot an arrow through your head, and if you survive, then you're the Messiah, or you can accept Islam." Well, he accepted Islam. He didn't want to get shot. And the result was there was a huge disillusionment and disappointment. There have been a couple of Protestant movements like this too. Wasn't there one where this guy went to the top of a mountain and they were waiting for to be ascended to heaven?
God. There are so many fools over the past 2,000 years. This is why even though I am kind of creeped out when you look at Agenda 2030 and all the things going on, like, oh, Christ dies in 2030. Could it really be coming in 2033? But you know what? You've got to know that is the devil's favorite head game to play on you, Christians.
Speaking of which,
it's been 2,000 years. There's been some idiot got everybody convinced. It happened. I'll just finish and then I'll let you talk, Charles. But for literally around the year 1000, it got really bad for real obvious reasons, right? And there was tons of people convinced, and the church had to act to stamp it out, only successfully. And but like every century or two, at least somebody's convinced the end times are here, and it's happening, and now, and everybody goes crazy. And what always happens is people who believe them wind up shattered. This happened in the 1800s several times in the United States. By the way, I will be talking to Michael Jones about this one and on Monday. But in the United States, the millenarian cults and the Schofield Reference Bible and all that crud, from the 1860s onward, it happened over and over again. People were convinced the end times were in the 1860s. Then it was in the 1870s. Then it was in the 1890s. Then it was the early 1900s. Then it
It's a
was,
cult thing. I mean, like remember the Hale Bop thing
yeah,
where they basically the men castrated themselves and then lied down in a field waiting to be zapped up to heaven. And it was really bizarre.
yeah, millennial. I mean, really, I would tell anyone. I don't know what the Jewish general attitude is, or the same one. Where he's like, well, if I found out that Jesus was returning tomorrow, I would continue to do everything I'm doing now and maybe try to tidy up a bit. Um, because really, you don't know when it's coming, and you're not given to know when it's coming. And in some sense, we're always in the end times. You know what I mean?
Of course,
That's
we always
that's
should be prepared. But yeah, I mean, the things people come in presumptuously and they claim to want to jump the gun a bit and that they know something. And anyway, so there was huge disillusionment. People were very depressed, and there was a complete renouncing of this Shabtai movement. However, Shabtai Zvi contained and continued to have a following that went underground. They became secret, and he would like convert to Islam, then he convert back to Judaism, convert again, and they kind of shapeshifted. He settled in Albania where he died, and his gravesite apparently is still there. And he developed an underground religion called the Donma, which means the secret group. And in Europe it was called the Sabadians. And they were corrupt. These were is a very heretical group that wanted to undermine the Torah. They wanted to, in a way, it's similar to what the left is trying to do today to religion. I mean, they would, they wanted to throw it out, and then 100 years later, maybe 100, maybe 70 years later, a follower of Shabtai Zvi emerged, Jacob Frank. He was a shoe salesman from Poland or something like that. And he claimed to have messianic pretenses. And he formed a movement that was even worse. And the rabbis had a war going on with this movement. That is a story that needs to be told. It's never really been documented, but they were excommunicating these people. They were exposing them. There was a big trial of this rabbi by the name of Jonathan Eberschutz, who turned out to have been a Sabadian, a secret Sabadian. These people were involved with all kinds of really bad stuff, very superstitious stuff. And they ultimately were successful at infiltrating and undermining and subverting much of Judaism. Now, the late Rabbi Marvin Antelman wrote a 2-volume set on this topic called To Eliminate the Opiate. And he argues that the Reform movement and the conservative movement in Judaism are Sabbatean movements. I don't know if he makes a great case for that, but he does get into a lot of very interesting underground stuff that went on in Judaism and continued to go on. Dr. Jones himself on my show pointed out that Sigmund Freud was rumored to have been a Frankist, and I don't doubt that for a minute. I think that's probably true.
That's where it comes down to me. At some point, you've got to recognize a heretical religious group for what it is. These guys were following an obvious false messiah and one who was a shapeshifter in his religious views and could just change from day to day. At some point, he's basically his own religion and his own cult, and his followers are their own religion and their own cult. Otherwise, you can get really warped in looking something like this, and you can say, well, ultimately, Fred Phelps and the Westboro Baptist Church is the fault of the Catholic Church, because after all, that's Christian. Right? Just by that series of logical steps, which doesn't actually work. And yeah, once you've left the root faith of whatever it is and gone off into your own whatever it is you think God's taken you to. Good luck and all, but you're gone. And once you start bringing in Babylonian mystery religions and Egyptian religions and your own weird experiences and your various schools of I'm trying to remember, of alchemy or whatever, you're done. You're no longer part of the Jewish thing. You're no longer part of the Christian thing. I mean, you can sit there and say, oh, well, we believe in Jesus and space aliens and all religions are the same. But you're not a Christian anymore.
And I think that the Sabbatean movement had a lot to do with the rise of the Jewish Bolsheviks, the Jewish communists, the Jewish left.
I must say, this is something I would even fault Michael Jones if he hasn't pointed it out. The Bolsheviks, one of the Bolsheviks' favorite things to shoot was an Orthodox Jew. The Bolsheviks.
Oh yeah, no, they were. Yeah, they were. That was the worst enemy. However, it is true that a lot of these people had Jewish backgrounds. It is a disgrace and it's a stain, a terrible stain on the Jewish history and the Jewish soul. I've written about it. I've written about it more vividly than Dr. Jones has written about it. And the problem is that because you still have so many Jews in the Jewish establishment who have a soft spot for this, that they've never really come to terms with it. And I think that Jews need to come to terms with this in the same way that Germans needed to come to terms with Hitler and Nazism. This is a very, very dark chapter in modern Jewish history. It's one that is something that, it should be acknowledged. It should be studied for what it is and why it happened. Right. Yeah.
And that's the godly person's attitude about any of this. As a Catholic, for example, I have zero problem going back and looking at the history of embarrassing incidents. At the same time, I maintain as Catholics, we have a right to put up a defense and not just say, like I'm sick of hearing that Galileo got burnt at the stake for saying the Earth went around the sun, and that's just not what happened at all.
Right,
and it's still things like that. It's just like, oh no, the Galileo affair was embarrassing, but or even in the history of Jewish-Catholic relations, sometimes the Catholics are the bad guys, but not always. And this is how adults should be able to discuss things.
That's right. It's complicated.
Yeah, they're complicated, but it is in everybody's best interest to quote the New Testament, as far as is possible, be on good terms with all men. That is like with all people, with everybody. I may not be quoting exactly that, but as far as is possible, be on good terms with everybody, like as a starting point to how you deal with people.
Right.
Which is also, by the way, why certain Christians annoy me, because they can't just do that. They have to pester people all the time. But whatever. Tell you what, Charlie, this is
more Protestants than Catholics, by the way. But
well, it's just and in defense of even my Lutheran and Methodist friends, they're not like that either.
I understand.
Lutherans, Methodists, but anyway, yeah, there's always that. And this has been so much fun, Charlie. I hope we can do this again soon.
Absolutely.
I've really enjoyed it. I want everybody to remember to please support and subscribe to Charles Moscowitz and his channel, and look for talks like that on there. It's not all you Michael Jones all the time, but we have fun talking about that. There really is. I'll say again, it was smart Jews that convinced me that it was okay to believe that there was a God. And at least two different Jews, including the son of a rabbi, were like, be Christian, that's good. And I'm like, and the other one said, Catholics are the only ones we really respect. So this is where I get into it with like Ted Schubert and some of them others too, man. You have to be able to talk to people and make friends with people, and nothing happens. All right, everybody. Thanks. God bless you, and shalom, Charles.
Thank you, Max. A pleasure as always, an honor. I admire what you're doing, and let's stay in touch.
All right, and everybody otherwise, please give us a like. Please give us a subscribe. Please find us on BitChute, and please find us on Libri. But we will stay here on YouTube until they kick us off. So give us a like, give us a subscribe. God bless everybody.
Thank you.